In the growing light, the Muslim soldiers could suddenly see the Christian force that had been shadowing them, and panic began to ripple through their ranks. Saladin, caught completely off guard, frantically tried to organize his scattered units into a battle formation. His nephew, Taqi ad-Din, attempted to form the vanguard, but there simply wasn't time. Baldwin did something that would become legendary. He ordered the relic of the True Cross, the holiest artifact in Christendom, to be raised high where all could see it. Then this 16-year-old boy, whose body was already being consumed by one of history's most horrific diseases, had himself helped down from his horse and knelt in prayer before his army. Contemporary sources describe the moment. Soldiers watching their dying king pray for victory, knowing they were about to charge into odds that made survival impossible, yet somehow finding courage in that broken figure kneeling in the dust. Baldwin rose, remounted, and gave the order to charge. The Knights Templar formed the spearhead, 80 of history's most elite warriors, men who had taken monastic vows to fight and die for Jerusalem. Their discipline was legendary, their skill in battle unmatched. Behind them came Baldwin's secular knights, the feudal levy of Jerusalem, men who knew they were probably riding to their deaths, and behind them came the peasants and townsmen, armed with whatever they could find, driven by faith and fear in equal measure. They hit Saladin's unprepared center like a steel wedge driven into wood. The heavily armored Frankish cavalry charging downhill at full gallop crashed into Muslim forces still trying to form ranks. The impact was catastrophic. Eyewitnesses described the Christian cavalry forming a wedge formation that simply obliterated everything in its path. This wasn't elegant fencing or tactical maneuvering. This was brutal, close-quarters slaughter. Horses screaming, steel crunching through bone, men dying in the mud, and chaos of medieval warfare at its most visceral. The Muslim army, despite its overwhelming numbers, simply disintegrated. Taqi ad-Din's son Ahmad fell in the early fighting. The elite Mamluk guards, Saladin's personal bodyguard of veteran warriors, tried to mount a resistance and were cut down where they stood. Common soldiers began throwing away their weapons and even their clothes to run faster. The battle became a rout, and the rout became a massacre. Saladin himself barely escaped with his life. According to Ralph de Deseto, a contemporary chronicler, the Sultan fled the battlefield on a racing camel with only a handful of bodyguards, while his army disintegrated behind him. The man who had united the Muslim world, who would eventually become one of history's most celebrated military commanders, ran for his life while his soldiers died by the thousands. November 25th, 1177. A 16-year-old boy stood before an army that stretched to the horizon. His hands were wrapped in bandages to hide the rotting flesh beneath. His body was slowly being consumed by leprosy, the most feared disease of the medieval world. Behind him stood just 500 knights and a few thousand hastily armed peasants. Ahead lay 26,000 battle-hardened warriors commanded by Saladin himself, the greatest Muslim general of the age, the man who would one day recapture Jerusalem and change the course of history. The odds were impossible. The situation was hopeless. No rational commander would have chosen to fight. But Baldwin IV, the leper king of Jerusalem, was about to prove that courage and desperation can sometimes rewrite the rules of war. This is the story of the most improbable victory in medieval history, and the dying king who made it happen. To understand what happened at Montgisard, you first need to understand the extraordinary young man who led the Christian forces that day. Baldwin was born in 1161 into a world of constant warfare, where the Crusader kingdoms carved from the Holy Land clung precariously to existence. His childhood should have been spent learning statecraft and swordsmanship, preparing to inherit a throne. Instead, it became a slow march toward an inevitable, horrifying death. When Baldwin was just 9 years old, his tutor, William of Tyre, noticed something disturbing during the boy's lessons. The young prince was playing roughly with other children, and William saw them pinching his right arm. Baldwin didn't flinch. He didn't cry out. He felt nothing. The realization must have hit William like a physical blow. This was leprosy, and there was no cure. The heir to Jerusalem was condemned to watch his own body slowly destroy itself. Think about that for a moment. At 9 years old, Baldwin learned he would never grow old, never marry, never have children. Medieval society viewed lepers as walking corpses, cursed by God, unclean, and untouchable. Most lepers were cast out, forced to ring bells to warn others of their approach, left to die alone in isolated colonies. But Baldwin was a prince, and when his father died in 1174, he became king at just 13 years old, a child with a death sentence, thrust onto a throne that was already crumbling beneath him. Here's what fascinates me about Baldwin. He refused to accept his fate. Despite the disease eating away at his nerves and flesh, despite knowing he would never see his 30th birthday, he trained relentlessly in warfare. He learned to fight with one hand when the other became useless. He studied tactics and strategy with the same intensity as other teenagers his age spent chasing girls. And, remarkably, his subjects loved him for it. Even Muslim chroniclers, his sworn enemies, wrote with amazement about how the Franks remained loyal to their leper king, how they paid no attention to his leprosy, and exalted him anyway. That loyalty was about to be tested like never before. By November 1177, Jerusalem faced what military historians call a perfect storm. Everything that could go wrong was going wrong simultaneously. The kingdom's internal politics were a mess of feuding nobles and succession disputes. Most critically, the bulk of the Crusader army had marched north to Syria with Philip of Alsace, a powerful European noble on pilgrimage, to besiege the fortress of Harim. This left Jerusalem practically defenseless, like a house with its doors wide open and its guards away on vacation. Into this power vacuum stepped Saladin. If Baldwin was the underdog of medieval history, Saladin was the favorite. The Kurdish general had done what seemed impossible. He'd united the fractious Muslim states of Egypt and Syria under his banner. He was brilliant, charismatic, and driven by a genuine religious fervor to push the Christian invaders back into the sea. By 1177, he was at the height of his power, commanding an army that one contemporary chronicler estimated at 26,000 men, including 8,000 elite cavalry and 18,000 warriors from Sudan. On November 18th, Saladin launched his invasion from Egypt. His strategy was textbook military doctrine: strike when your enemy is weakest, move fast, and overwhelm them before they can organize a defense. His scouts had confirmed that Jerusalem's army was scattered, that the boy king was sick with malaria, that the city lay virtually unprotected. Everything pointed to an easy victory. Saladin's troops swept through the coastal plain, sacking the cities of Ramla and Lydda, looting and plundering as they advanced. Jerusalem itself seemed within grasp, and nothing stood in the way. Nothing except a dying teenager who refused to give up. When news of Saladin's invasion reached Jerusalem, panic swept through the city. People flooded into the citadel of David, seeking whatever protection stone walls could offer. The court must have been in chaos. Their king was 16 years old, ravaged by disease, and commanding a force so small it was almost laughable. Any sensible advisor would have counseled surrender, or at least negotiation. Cut your losses, save what you can, live to fight another day. Baldwin rejected all of it. Despite still recovering from malaria, despite his deteriorating condition, he gathered every knight he could find, all 375 of them, and rode south toward Ascalon. His plan was desperate: hold the coastal fortress and somehow prevent Saladin from marching on Jerusalem. It was a token resistance at best, a speed bump in the path of an avalanche. On November 22nd, Baldwin reached Ascalon just hours before Saladin's vanguard appeared on the horizon. The young king led his tiny force out to meet the Muslim army, took one look at the sea of banners and glinting spears stretching into the distance, and made the only rational decision available. He retreated back into the city walls, and this is where the story should have ended. Baldwin was trapped. Saladin had him bottled up in Ascalon, and the road to Jerusalem lay open. The Sultan must have felt the same confidence a chess player feels when delivering checkmate. The game was over, only the formalities remained. Rather than waste time besieging a fortified city, Saladin left a screening force to keep Baldwin contained and moved the bulk of his army toward Jerusalem. His commanders were so confident of victory that they took time to plunder the wealthy cities along their route. The soldiers spread out to forage for supplies, to gather additional resources, to enjoy the spoils of what seemed like an already won campaign. It was the kind of overconfidence that destroys empires, and Baldwin was watching. The young king did something that still impresses military historians today. Under the cover of darkness, he smuggled messages to the Knights Templar garrisoned at Gaza, ordering them to abandon their fortress and join him. When they arrived, 80 warrior monks in their distinctive white mantles with red crosses, Baldwin made his move. He issued what was called an arrière ban, a general mobilization order that required every able-bodied Christian man to take up arms in defense of the realm. Peasants and townsmen, priests and merchants, anyone who could hold a weapon was conscripted on the spot. Then Baldwin did something even more audacious. He broke out of Ascalon with his combined force and began shadowing Saladin's army along the coast. Think about that tactical decision. He was still outnumbered at least 6-1. He had no heavy infantry to speak of, just a few thousand hastily armed civilians. His cavalry, though elite, numbered barely 500 men. And he was pursuing one of the greatest generals in Islamic history. If you're wondering whether like and subscribe buttons ever felt more earned, this is the moment, because what happened next defies every military principle ever written. For 3 days, Baldwin's ragtag army followed Saladin's massive force like wolves tracking a herd. They couldn't attack directly. That would be suicide. But Baldwin was looking for something specific, a mistake, a moment of weakness, a chance to strike where the enemy least expected it. He was banking everything on Saladin's overconfidence, on the natural human tendency to relax when victory seems assured. And Saladin gave him exactly what he needed. As the Muslim army advanced toward Jerusalem, discipline began to break down. Units spread out across the countryside, foraging independently. The baggage train, heavy with siege equipment and supplies, became mired in muddy ground near a small stream. The horses, which had marched all the way from Egypt, were exhausted. The soldiers, laden with plunder from Ramla and Lydda, were more focused on their loot than on maintaining formation. Nobody was expecting an attack because the threat had supposedly been neutralized back in Ascalon. Near the mound of Montgisard, close to the city of Ramla, Baldwin saw his opportunity. Saladin's army was strung out, disorganized, and unprepared for battle. It was now or never. Dawn broke on November 25, 1177. The feast day of St. Catherine of Alexandria. What happened next has been depicted in paintings, novels, and films, but the reality was somehow both more brutal and more magnificent than any artistic recreation. Baldwin ordered his men to halt. In the growing light, the Muslim soldiers could suddenly see the Christian force that had been shadowing them, and panic began to ripple through their ranks. Saladin, caught completely off guard, frantically tried to organize his scattered units into a battle formation. His nephew, Taqi ad-Din, attempted to form the vanguard, but there simply wasn't time. Baldwin did something that would become legendary. He ordered the relic of the true cross, the holiest artifact in Christendom, to be raised high where all could see it. Then this 16-year-old boy, whose body was already being consumed by one of history's most horrific diseases, had himself helped down from his horse and knelt in prayer before his army. Contemporary sources describe the moment. Soldiers watching their dying king pray for victory, knowing they were about to charge into odds that made survival impossible, yet somehow finding courage in that broken figure kneeling in the dust. Baldwin rose, remounted, and gave the order to charge. The Knights Templar formed the spearhead. 80 of history's most elite warriors, men who had taken monastic vows to fight and die for Jerusalem. Their discipline was legendary, their skill in battle unmatched. Behind them came Baldwin's secular knights, the feudal levy of Jerusalem, men who knew they were probably riding to their deaths, and behind them came the peasants and townsmen, armed with whatever they could find, driven by faith and fear in equal measure. They hit Saladin's unprepared center like a steel wedge driven into wood. The heavily armored Frankish cavalry charging downhill at full gallop crashed into Muslim forces still trying to form ranks. The impact was catastrophic. Eyewitnesses described the Christian cavalry forming a wedge formation that simply obliterated everything in its path. This wasn't elegant fencing or tactical maneuvering. This was brutal, close-quarters slaughter. Horses screaming, steel crunching through bone, men dying in the mud, and chaos of medieval warfare at its most visceral. The Muslim army, despite its overwhelming numbers, simply disintegrated. Taqi ad-Din's son Ahmad fell in the early fighting. The elite Mamluk guards, Saladin's personal bodyguard of veteran warriors, tried to mount a resistance and were cut down where they stood. Common soldiers began throwing away their weapons and even their clothes to run faster. The battle became a rout, and the rout became a massacre. Saladin himself barely escaped with his life. According to Ralph de Desato, a contemporary chronicler, the Sultan fled the battlefield on a racing camel with only a handful of bodyguards while his army disintegrated behind him. The man who had united the Muslim world, who would eventually become one of history's most celebrated military commanders, ran for his life while his soldiers died by the thousands. Only the fall of darkness prevented the complete annihilation of his force. For 12 miles the Christians pursued, cutting down fleeing Muslims until exhaustion and nightfall finally ended the slaughter. By the time the sun set on November 25th, the impossible had become reality. Saladin's grand army was destroyed. Contemporary sources report that only 10% of his forces made it back to Cairo, arriving on December 8th. The losses weren't just in manpower, though those were staggering, but in equipment, horses, prestige, and psychological momentum. The unstoppable conqueror had been stopped by a dying teenager. The cost for the Christians was also severe. Roger de Moulins, Grand Master of the Knights Hospitallers, reported 1,100 dead and 750 wounded from Baldwin's small force. These weren't acceptable casualties in the modern sense. They were catastrophic losses representing nearly half the fighting force. But they had won. Against all odds, against every principle of military doctrine, they had won. I want you to think about what this victory meant. It wasn't just about saving Jerusalem for a few more years, though that was significant. It was about what happens when leadership, timing, and sheer bloody-minded courage combine at exactly the right moment. Baldwin had no business winning this battle. By every logical calculation, his army should have been swept aside like leaves in a storm. But he saw an opportunity that existed for maybe 6 hours in one specific location, against an enemy who had made one critical mistake. And he took it. Here's what strikes me most about Montgisard. It wasn't a miracle, despite what medieval chroniclers claimed. It was a good generalship meeting extraordinary luck. Baldwin didn't pray for divine intervention and wait for God to smite his enemies. He prayed, then he got on his horse, bandaged hands barely able to hold the reins, and led a charge into an army that outnumbered him 20-1. There's something deeply human about that, something that transcends the religious conflicts and medieval politics. It's the story of someone who refused to accept that his situation was hopeless, who kept fighting when everyone else would have given up. Muslim historians understood the magnitude of what had happened. They wrote that Saladin's defeat was so complete, so devastating, that it could only be redeemed by his victories 10 years later at the battles of Crusades and Hattin, culminating in the recapture of Jerusalem in 1187. That's how badly Montgisard hurt. It took a decade for Saladin to overcome the psychological and military damage. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Did this battle really save Europe, as the title suggests? The honest answer is more complicated than a simple yes or no. Montgisard was a decisive tactical victory that gave Jerusalem a temporary reprieve, but it didn't fundamentally change the strategic situation. Saladin would return stronger than before. In 1179, just 2 years later, he defeated Baldwin at the Battle of Jacob's Ford, and in 1187, at the catastrophic Battle of Hattin, he destroyed the Crusader field army and recaptured Jerusalem. Baldwin himself died in 1185 at just 24 years old, his body finally succumbing to the leprosy that had tormented him since childhood. So, if the Christians eventually lost anyway, why does Montgisard matter? Because history isn't just about final outcomes, it's about the moments when ordinary people do extraordinary things. Baldwin IV ruled for less than a decade, and throughout that time, he fought 5 major campaigns against Saladin, winning some and losing others, but never giving up, never surrendering to his disease or to his enemies. He bought his kingdom years of survival when it should have fallen in 1177. He proved that a 16-year-old with a terminal illness could outwit and outfight one of history's greatest military commanders. The legacy of Montgisard lives on in unexpected ways. Modern historians study it as a masterclass in asymmetric warfare and the importance of psychological factors in combat. It appears in popular culture, most notably in Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven, where Edward Norton's haunting portrayal of Baldwin captured something of the real king's quiet courage. Video games like Darkest Dungeon feature characters explicitly inspired by the Leper King. And whenever anyone searches for historical examples of impossible victories or David versus Goliath battles, Montgisard appears near the top of the list. What made 500 knights able to crush 26,000 warriors? It wasn't divine intervention or medieval magic. It was leadership. Baldwin's decision to pursue when others would have hidden. It was discipline. The Templars' ability to maintain formation and strike with precision in the chaos of battle. It was timing, catching Saladin's army at the one moment when they were vulnerable. And it was courage, the willingness to charge into overwhelming odds because the alternative was unthinkable. So, here's my challenge to you. When you face your own impossible odds, when the situation seems hopeless, and every rational voice tells you to give up, remember the 16-year-old leper king who refused to accept defeat. Remember that sometimes the most important battles aren't the ones we win permanently, but the ones we fight when fighting itself seems impossible. Baldwin didn't save Jerusalem forever, but he saved it when it mattered most. He proved that one person, even a dying child, can change the course of history if they're willing to risk everything. If this story moved you, if you found yourself rooting for that dying teenager against the overwhelming odds, leave a comment below. Which historical battle do you want to hear about next? And subscribe, because there are countless more stories like this waiting to be told, tales of impossible courage and the humans who made history by refusing to accept the impossible. The Battle of Montgisard reminds us that sometimes, just sometimes, 500 determined souls can indeed change the world,